Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Today, June 20th, is World Refugee Day. Just recently, the UN Refugee Agency has released drastic numbers, saying that 70.8 million people in 2018 fled war, persecution, and conflict. That is the highest number that the agency has seen in its years since it came into existence. What exactly is behind all of this, and why are these numbers increasing at such a drastic rate? Also, how are refugees treated in the countries that they flee to? There are concerns about, for example, refugee girls in Lebanon. All of that we're going to discuss in this show. We're going to start off, though, by speaking to the UNHCR spokesperson, Mr. Babar Baloch, who is joining us now in Geneva. Babar, thank you for joining us here in Scope. Babar, what are your reflections on this 70.8 million number? I know that the UN Refugee Agency has said that that too is just a ballpark estimate, as we're not really taking into account the issues in Venezuela, for example.
Thank you for having me on this show, Waqar. Indeed, the numbers look staggering. We are talking about 70.8 million desperate people who have been forced out of their homes. It's just not a sheer number. These are all human beings, individual like you and I, and like the viewers. It includes women and children. Every every second refugee is a child, for instance. And if you kind of dig deep into these numbers, we see the biggest chunk is of the IDPs, people who are internally displaced within their own countries, within the borders, because this is what happens when you are forced out of your home. You try to find sanctuary or safety in your neighborhood. That number is over 41 million. And then comes the refugee numbers, which is 26 million now. So today is World Refugee Day, and it's a call for solidarity with all those people who kind of have picked up the courage to go and find safety somewhere else.
So then, if you can, just for a moment, just tell what the United Nations is at this time doing when it comes to the issue of IDPs, because as you correctly pointed out, for a lot of us, we tend to discuss more about refugees who are fleeing to other countries and less, in fact, about IDPs. That seems to be, at least for the international community, an issue which largely goes unnoticed.
Exactly. And when we say that these people are forced out of their homes and are displaced within their own country, so the first responder or the responsibility lies on the countries itself. And at times when the countries cannot cope with it, we at UNHCR, we step forward to offer support. Just 2 days ago, I was briefing the Geneva press here about over 300,000 people who had to leave their homes in the Democratic Republic of the Congo within 2 weeks. And this, they were forced out of insecurity. There were clashes, violence unleashed against civilians. And when we did the mathematics, around 22,000 people fleeing per day. So we step forward in many countries in terms of providing shelter. The most important thing is wherever they go, they can find safety. And then there's shelter, there is food, and bringing back hope in their lives, in the people who are displaced. Either they are refugees or they are IDPs, trying to make sure that children are able to go back to school, their health issues are looked after, they have safety. So all these efforts go hand in hand, but the problem is resources. Most of the time, we don't have enough funding to provide support to all of these people.
So then, Babar, I imagine it's a challenge for UNHCR then to get those sorts of resources and funding at a time when it seems, at least, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of the global community and global governments, I should say, around the world are becoming ever more strict when it comes to the issue of refugees and asylum seekers, etc. It seems that borders and walls are going up in many places around the world.
Indeed, Waqar. And what we are asking, or what this day reflects, is responsibility sharing and also an understanding. What we have seen is the majority of the world's refugee 84% are either in poor countries, underdeveloping countries, or developed countries, or developing countries. For instance, take Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan has used to be the number one refugee host for many, many years. And still, you have more than 1 million registered Afghan refugees in the country. So the call is on, it's a global call, that those countries who can support should step forward to help countries who have been hosting refugees for decades and decades. And this report also reflects that in every 5 refugees who have been forced to leave their country, 4 are those who have been refugees for around 5 or more years. 1 in every 5 will be a person who has been a refugee for more than 20 years.
And I think that's an important point you made there, Babar. You know, many times, for example, I'll just take the example of Bangladesh, for example, and its hosting of the Rohingyas at this time, and you know the decisions it has made vis-a-vis that island and to place the Rohingyas there, for example. You know, a lot of these countries come under severe criticism by the international community. But do you think that a lot of us miss the context of the fact that these influxes of refugees and asylum seekers brings a lot of pressure on infrastructure in any country, especially in such large numbers?
Indeed, it does. And most of the times we have seen communities, countries not having enough resources, but have big hearts. And that's where our concern lies. Today is a call for responsibility sharing between all the countries, especially the rich countries. Try to understand that most of these people go to countries which are underdeveloped or are developing. They're struggling with themselves, but they have big hearts and they have allowed these refugees to go there. So we had a meeting in New York where all countries came together to agree on a global refugee compact, which means you share your responsibility, but also not sharing responsibility, recognizing what other countries are doing. What's also worrying is the language which is being used about refugees and migrants in these days, and also the way issues are politicized. At the end, we need to understand these are human beings. Providing safety to these desperate human beings has been a long, long tradition that the humanity has. We shouldn't be losing our humanity when refugees go and arrive at a country trying to seek safety.
Indeed. And tell us then about the cooperation, if you can, Babar, between the different UN bodies, because I imagine the UNHCR cannot work independently, specifically on these sorts of issues, than, for example, the more political bodies within the UN, where peace building and bringing peace to other parts of the world is important, because this all goes hand in hand, doesn't it? People flee their countries only because of course, as this report says, war, persecution, etc.
Exactly. I mean, we are a humanitarian agency and organization, UNHCR. We look after refugees, internally displaced, all those people who are forced out of their homes. But the call goes back to the big countries. Let's not forget, United Nations is based on all the nations which are members of the UN. So our call is the first thing that a refugee or an IDP wants to do is to return back home. So if all these countries can work together to bring peace, like places like Afghanistan, take Syria, Myanmar, from where Rohingyas have fled, many countries in Africa, in the Middle East. So if they are able to broker peace, these refugees will go back home. They don't become refugees by choice. But the problem is conflicts prolong. Syria has been there now more than 5 years. You have Afghanistan for 4 decades. We are talking about 40 years of instability and insecurity. And then we are seeing new situations being added, like in the DRC in Africa, and Venezuela, which has come up now since last few years. You have now 4 million people from Venezuela who have been forced out of their homes or they had to leave the country.
And, Babar, the global narrative, or many of the narratives that's being spoken about that is disturbing, as you had pointed out in an earlier answer, about refugees, is that they take away jobs of citizens of the respective countries that they go to. So if I'm talking about the rich countries, for example, and we can pick any of them, really, European or Western in general, do you think that is true? Or is it, as many reports, I believe even UN reports have argued, that in fact refugees/asylum seekers actually contribute a lot to respective economies worldwide?
Indeed, it's not a fact. And this is wrong information that you quite often see in the public debate being presented. For example, take a look at Germany. Germany is top on the list. They have more than 1 million refugees. What they have done efforts to help these refugees integrate. When refugees arrive, they have skills. And it all goes back. They're ordinary human beings and people like you and I. They have education, they have skills, they can help the local community, the local economy. And we have seen in places like Kenya and other places, refugees create a market as well. So the hosts benefit. The only way is that we have to find a way to manage. And it all has to be based on compassion, not on fear.
And then, Babar, another concern that a lot when we're talking about refugees is that if, for example, the Italian government or others who are receive a lot of the refugees that come over because they're at the shore, really, and their concern is obviously border security. They can't just have a free flow of people coming in, and secondly, of human trafficking. How important are those factors?
Border management is an important issue, and we at UNHCR, we say border management and providing desperate people safety can go hand in hand. You just need to have a mechanism in place. And let's not forget, all refugees, everyone who become a refugee, they're not heading to Europe, not at all. Look at the figures. 84% of the world's 26 million refugees are in the neighboring countries, hoping if the situation gets better, they will be able to return back home sooner. The other thing is, when these desperate people arrive at their doorsteps, and we have seen in Europe, in the Mediterranean Sea, many thousands of people have lost their lives trying to make that journey because there are no legal avenues. Traffickers and smugglers prey on these desperate people. For them, they don't care about the lives of these desperate people. They just prey on them to make more money. For them, it's a business. So if these countries can make sure or ensure that there are legal pathways for these desperate people when they have to leave and flee their countries to get there, and at the end, if you have a good system in terms of your asylum system and you find out that this person is not in need of international protection, not a refugee, still treat them humanly, but at the end, if they need to be sent back, you can send them back home. But refugees cannot be pressured to return home till the time is good for them.
But Babar, I'm just going to throw out an example. ISIS, for example, it's essentially been defeated according to many estimates and many governments around the world. So, for example, if an ISIS member were to try to go to Europe or to some other country, really anywhere in the world, within the region even, it's hard to imagine that any government would be able to accept that sort of situation where it is a possibility, is it not, that an ISIS member would try to sneak in and try to build a new life for himself or herself? How does one deal with such sensitive security issues, do you think?
Let's not forget that refugees quite often flee from the same terror unleashed against them by these groups. And within the asylum systems, there is a way to find out who is who. And people who have been involved in any activities, they don't qualify to become refugees. This is a very important point to make. Everyone has the safety concerns. Refugees are fleeing from that terror. They are seeking safety. They don't want their neighborhoods where they go and settle to become targets.
Very well, Babar. We'll leave it there at that. But of course, we sincerely appreciate your time speaking to us there from Geneva today. That was Babar Baloch, who is the UNHCR spokesperson, giving us context, of course, which is very important about this issue of refugees and asylum seekers and IDPs, internally displaced people, which is in fact the largest number of the 70 million figure that I quoted earlier. We'll be back, though, with our other guests to discuss this issue further. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here in the scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and we're continuing to discuss World Refugee Day, which falls on the 20th of June every year, and that very sad milestone that it seems the world has reached, at least in 2018, about 70.8 million refugees and displaced people, I should say, pardon me, worldwide. That is a number which the UNHCR has never seen before in its years of existence. To continue the discussion, we're now joined by Peter Verovšek, who is an international relations expert. He's a lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Sheffield. He's joining us now from Sheffield itself via Skype. And we're also joined by Bernat Ferrer, who is a journalist and public affairs manager. He's joining us now from Barcelona. Bernat and Peter, thank you both for joining us. Peter, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the global response to the issue of displaced people? It seems that a lot of the narrative, at least where you are in Europe, always becomes about how there's this invasion of people.
Yeah, I think this narrative of an invasion really says a lot, because it shows how the issue of immigration has been securitized around the world, and especially in Europe, with the idea of Fortress Europe, and the response inevitably being to beef up border security, to increase funding for Frontex, to increase the use of technological solutions. And I think that is sort of in many ways really a betrayal of the whole system, the whole international system for refugee protection that was set up in the aftermath of the Second World War, which was supposed to put this all under the remit of international law and regulation. And now we're seeing these issues being militarized once more, just as they were at the interwar years.
And Bernat, you know, the interesting thing, isn't it, is that in fact, this region itself, the Middle East region, I mean, is the one that actually takes in the most displaced people, the most refugees in comparison to even Europe or otherwise. So why do you think it is that the narrative still remains that, oh my God, Europe is being invaded?
Well, the narrative, it's what don't think about an elephant, no? It's one of the reasons where the people who have the power, no, can manipulate the people who fears to lose their jobs here in Europe or maybe in the US or Canada. No, it's a way to manage fears and use this fear to obtain political power. Here in Europe, we can see how the far right and the right more strict is growing everywhere. Even the Social Democrats in Denmark, they have adopted a very strong message against immigration. And that's the game, to play with this fear to lose our jobs against people who is arriving from the Middle East, maybe, or Morocco, or the Sub-Saharan Africa, who they have not our education levels. No, it's a kind of game.
Yeah, so I wonder then, Peter, you know, do you think that this sort of concerns that a lot of these sort of politicians, far-right politicians especially, of course, try to ride on, are those concerns legitimate? Because, you know, on one side you would say, listen, you can't just have a free-for-all. You can't have just everybody show up at your door and you let them in. But at the same time, then what of human rights and the fact that European countries would see themselves as morally, at least, above other countries around the world, as far as human rights, et cetera, go?
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways the refugee issue is a real test for Europe's commitment to human rights and to humanitarian aid. You have all these people sort of showing up on the doorstep of Europe, And you see, in some senses, a real disagreement within Europe about whether they should be welcomed, as Angela Merkel famously tried to do in accepting 1 million migrants in 2015, or whether they should be rejected, as we've seen sort of throughout Eastern and Central Europe with the building of barriers and other forms of fences, the criminalization of help to migrants, and even the persecution in Italy of certain activists who helped to rescue migrants from death on the Mediterranean. Yeah. So in some sense, you see here a real disagreement within Europe. The irony, of course, is that this is all driven by economic issues in the short term. But in the long term, given its birth rates, Europe is going to need to accept refugees from elsewhere if it's going to want to keep up the welfare state that most European countries, and especially social democrats, are committed to.
And then, Bernat, one of the major issues I always feel gets left out when we're talking about these issues is the root causes of why it is people would even want to leave their countries to begin with. Why isn't Europe, or why isn't the rest of the world, do you think, dealing with the war, with the persecution that is taking place in those respective countries, and not resolving that situation first as a priority, which would, ensure safety and security for everybody around the world?
That's the key question of nowadays, no? How or why, with the European resources, we can't manage to improve maybe the North African quality of life, no? There's many implications, but there are a lot of humanitarian aid who is given to the local governments that Europe can't analyze if this humanitarian aid goes to the people or goes to the politicians or maybe the monarchy. In Morocco, we have a monarchy who has improved their wealth in a no logic way, and we have to ask ourselves why, with the lots and lots of euros and money who we pay to Morocco to control the immigration, why the Moroccan monarchy is improving its wealth. And I'm talking about Morocco, but we can talk about the most other people, most other governments, and we can manage correctly this humanitarian aid.
It seems, Peter, to me at least, as a no-brainer, that, listen, if you resolve the situations in those respective countries, people would want to go back home, obviously. So why isn't Europe prioritizing that, or why isn't the rest of the world prioritizing that? Because I imagine we obviously live in a world which is interconnected anyhow. So if there's going to be continuing chaos in certain parts of the world, that can never be a good thing for anybody anywhere in the world.
I think the biggest problem is that these issues that are facing a lot of the countries where these migrants are coming from are actually very difficult to solve. We know that's true of many of the states in Africa where many of these migrants are coming from. We certainly know that's true of Syria, where the West has been incapable of solving that situation despite the attempts over a number of years. And the biggest issue, which I think is one that you didn't mention, is the issue of climate change and climate migration, which is going to become a bigger and bigger problem moving forward. So I think the issue here is not only one of humanitarian aid, which is clearly lacking, but it's also the fact that the issues that are driving, the push factors that are driving these migrants to leave are actually very complicated. It's not clear that there are any easy solutions, and certainly throwing more money at the problem and giving more money to the leaders of these various countries to stop or control immigration, as Europe has tried to do through Frontex, or as Trump has now tried to do using sort of the stick of tariffs against Mexico, is probably not going to be a long-term solution.
Exactly. And then on that point, Bernat, and I wonder that if not going to be a long-term solution, considering what we've seen vis-a-vis the global response to this entire issue, be it because of climate change, as Peter there correctly mentioned, or other reasons such as war, persecution, etc., will this all just become a lot worse? Will the numbers, for example, for 2019 be a lot higher, do you think, than 70.8 million displaced people?
Yeah, there's no any future scenario where this actual situation is improving, because we see many European countries, even the European Commission, they are concerned about local problems. So this way they cannot even imagine how to solve foreign problems as they think these are. I think in the days and the years ago, this situation will grow every year, because the climate change is a fact. We can see how in the Sahara region the climate is hotter every year, and in the sub-Saharan Africa, the conditions to manage an agriculture like the traditional way, it's even difficult than years ago. So people have to get alive, and they think to migrate to Europe. In Europe, local parties, nobody thinks that their first problem.
Yeah.
So this fact is being put behind the others.
Okay, so Peter, if I pick on France for just a moment, it can be argued that the French foreign policies, its involvement, for example, in Libya or even Mali and other places in Africa, have been unhelpful, haven't they been, when it comes to stability, for example, in those respective countries? So I wonder, just on the issue of foreign policies of these countries, isn't that a basic first step, or shouldn't it be a basic first step, that these countries should make a pledge, or should pledge not to get involved elsewhere in the world unless completely necessary?
I think the last part of that, the statement you just made, the part about being completely necessary, is the difficult part. Because I think around Libya, there was actually a lot of critique of the Obama administration for not getting involved in Libya. That was seen as an overreaction to sort of the very bad situation that resulted in Iraq after the invasion of Iraq by George Bush. So I think it's very difficult. And there is a sort of sense, I think, in countries that they don't want to become involved because precisely of the principle, you break it, you own it. So I think now more and more, there was a period of nation building, or when countries were very positive about the ability to spread democracy in the 90s and early 2000s. Now I think the world and the international community has become much more skeptical of their ability to enforce these kind of changes. And in some ways, that has given dictators a certain amount, a feeling of impunity, that they can do whatever they want. And so, the question is really, do we want to deal with these problems on the front end by getting involved in those countries themselves, or do we want to deal with the consequences of not being involved, which in many ways ends up being migration and sort of having dictators pushing minority communities and other unwanted individuals out of their countries and sort of creating problems in neighboring states and then obviously in the West as well.
But then, Peter, just before going to break, can you think of any example in contemporary history, at least, where European involvement or Western involvement has actually been a good thing and has created stability anywhere?
I think it's very difficult to come up with examples, especially I think Europe has a very checkered history of its involvements. I think that there was a lot of potential, and in certain cases in Yugoslavia, I think the involvement of Europe had real potential. Unfortunately, there the problem was that the peacekeepers were not active enough in preventing certain atrocities from occurring.
Yeah.
But in certain parts of the Balkans, I think their presence was certainly very helpful. And I think it is possible to see other areas or other situations where that might have been done better.
All right, we're going to go into a short break now, viewers. Ask you, of course, to stay with us as we continue this conversation about World Refugee Day and what this means. And we're going to try to concentrate more on specific country case studies, even indicating, of course, the situation in Lebanon as a host country for many refugees who are fleeing war, specifically in Syria, and even Palestinians. Do stay with us. We'll be back with that. Thanks for staying with us here in Scope, viewers. With me, Waqar Rizvi. We've continued to discuss World Refugee Day, which is today, June 20th. To continue the conversation, we're still with Peter Verovšek, who is a lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Sheffield. He's still with us from Sheffield via Skype. We're also now joined by Bernardo Venturi, who is a senior fellow at IAI, where he focuses on Africa, civilian crisis management, peace building, and development. He's joining us now via Skype from Rome. And we're also joined by Professor Kaunert, who is a professor of policing and security and is also the director of the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. He's joining us now on the line from Cardiff. Christian, Bernardo, and Peter, thank you for joining us. Peter, I'll continue with you, if I may, for a moment. When we're talking about different case studies around the world, Peter, we can talk about, of course, countries like Lebanon and them hosting very large numbers of refugees. Do you think that there is sort of a disconnect on the part of much of the international community about those host countries which do take in a very large number of refugees and the kinds of pressures that that puts on their infrastructure and even their native population?
Yes, of course. I think there's a huge disconnect. I mean, in Europe, the opposition to refugees is really driven by financial concerns. And yet we see that the amount of money per capita that European nations spend, and even the number of refugees they bring in per capita, are much lower than the amount being spent by other countries that, in many cases, have less arable land, have greater difficulties with food supply, have obviously less money. We see that they are actually bearing the brunt of this, and there's some attempts to provide some aid, but that aid is not nearly enough. And we see that in many cases, these problems are being exported by Europe precisely to countries that can handle these pressures even less than Europe can. And I think that really shows that one of the key problems here is precisely that we're sort of operating within the system of sovereign nation states, and that the countries that are on the front lines here then inevitably bear the brunt as Europe sort of securitizes its borders and keeps migrants out.
Bernardo, you're in Italy, so it makes sense to ask you this question. With Salvini and others and their sort of policies towards migrants and refugees and asylum seekers, do you think that that's something that can long-term work? Because that puts pressure then back on countries such as Lebanon or other regional countries to take in even more. Can this situation go on the way it is?
Yeah, I mean, the current government in Italy, it's really creating an enemy. So it's portraying migrants and refugees as just people coming here without any needs and just stealing jobs and these kind of things. So the public opinion is shifting from a welcoming approach that was really present in the past year to a more, I'm not afraid to say, racist approach to some extent. And in particular, the last decree that was approved in Italy, it's really discriminating refugees and asylum seekers because it's against some long-standing humanitarian imperative like sea rescue or safety for refugees, first of all. And for instance, we are still discussing about Libya, and the government really consider a safe place Libya, while the news and the analysts are describing Libya as one of the worst places on earth to some extent for refugees and migrants and asylum seekers. There are thousands of interviews describing how how the migrants are really considered as nothing in refugees camps and in welcoming structure in Libya. So the situation is really dangerous for them there. And but that's not a discussion in Italy. I mean, there are some NGOs and some opposition parties trying to describe what is going on, some good journalists.
Okay.
But really the government seems that it's not caring about the situation of refugees in Libya that are really facing extreme violence and abuses every day for months.
Christian, I wonder what you make of the fact that from a security point of view, is it smart to have all these walls and limits going up across the world, really? And specifically, we can talk, of course, about Europe and Italy, as I put to Bernardo, because, in a place like Lebanon, for example, and I'm only honing in on that example because a recent report has come out about refugee girls there being sexually abused on a regular basis, sexually harassed, I should say, on a regular basis by many people who are part of the native population, native Lebanese themselves. And the report contextualizes that as saying, listen, Lebanon has taken in so many people over so many years. Since 1948, in fact, it's hosted Palestinians as well. Do you think that sort of disconnect on the part of the greater international community actually creates more dangers for them than it solves?
Yeah, I think you're putting your finger on something quite important. I think the issue of walls has been brought up, obviously, by U.S. President Trump, who was talking about the wall with Mexico. And I think it's an expression of we want to keep them out. We want to keep them out, want to separate us from what is perceived to be the enemy. And the reality is, of course, a little bit different in the sense that from a security point of view, in many, many places in the world, that doesn't make an awful lot of sense. If you think about, well, what are the security risks inherent in refugee flows? Well, I'm not there to say that there are none, but of course, the big debate, for instance, that there had been in terms of the European refugee crisis had been about possible terrorists coming into Europe via the refugee streams, when the empirical reality was, yes, there have been occasional people, but on the whole, there were not, for the most part, terrorists. For the vast majority of people, they were genuine refugees, and in that sense, building the wall. I mean, again, Viktor Orban in Hungary is another example who built big fences around Hungary to stop them from coming in, and in fact, those fences were not particularly effective of keeping people out. The numbers that Hungary received as a result of those fences were still equally as high as if they hadn't been erected. So in that sense, is it effective? In the vast majority of cases, it's not effective on security grounds alone, but also on political grounds, it's not particularly effective.
This context that we're providing about regional countries such as Lebanon and others hosting many, many refugees, do you think that sort of context is something that is understood by many people in Europe or in other parts of the Western world? Or do you think that there is a certain degree of, if I may use the term, misinformation provided to them, which then creates that alarm in their minds?
Well, with regard to the first question, do most people understand that there are those countries that host quite a large number of refugees? I don't think so. I think a lot of people have this impression that most of the refugees that are coming in, they're coming into European countries, they're coming into Western countries. So the vast majority of people don't realize that the number is actually, much, much higher in the countries that are outside the European Union. So I think that is not very well understood. I don't think it's necessarily the case that this is a case of misinformation, but it's rather a disinterest to an extent, that people are not very aware as to what happens in these countries, and as a result of that, they're not particularly aware that actually some of those countries are hosting large number of refugees. So in that sense, I don't think it's a sustainable solution because, of course, the country that you're mentioning, Lebanon, is a very small country with a lot of its own political problems.
Indeed.
So, of course, this contributes to a sense that this is not a solution for the future, and I think a different system would be beneficial.
So then, so in this case, then, as you say there, Christian, people are ignoring this at their own peril, aren't there? So I wonder, why aren't there more voices, or maybe there are, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, voices across Europe and across the international community and Western world who are then voicing these concerns that, listen, you can't just ignore what's happening in the world, because whatever happens, for example, in Lebanon, if there's instability there because of the issue of refugees and otherwise, that will affect the rest of the world, isn't it? I mean, we do live in a globalized era after all.
Exactly. I mean, this will affect the rest of the world, and this will affect Europe. To be fair, there's a number of NGOs that are trying to make that argument, and that are trying to say, well, look, there's a real issue that we have here, and we need to do more. But what we also have at the moment is a political environment across the Western world that has been dominated by a discourse that hasn't been very beneficial in that sense. It's a discourse where refugees are seen increasingly as a security threat, where refugees are seen increasingly as terrorists, and this is not particularly helpful in the kind of climate to make a rational argument to say, well, we acknowledge there are certain issues, but the vast majority of people are normal people that are fleeing circumstances and in fact are the victims of terrorism rather than the perpetrators. So this is an argument that needs to go through, and it is very difficult to make the argument when the political environment is such that people don't often want to hear this argument.
Okay, so we just have a few minutes left. I wanted to get thoughts from Peter and Bernardo. Peter, I'll start with you. With the EU elections that just happened, many people said that the far right would come out on top, but it seems that it wasn't that simple, right? We also had Greens winning out as well, I believe, in certain parts of Europe. So do you think that sometimes when we talk about far right and this anti-immigrant sentiment, that's sort of overstated? Do you think actually most Europeans would be happy and more welcoming to refugees than even their governments are?
I think that's certainly the optimistic interpretation. I'm a little bit more skeptical. I think in certain ways, stopping the far right in the European elections was more due to the fact that a lot of center-right parties and even certain center-left parties started to adopt some of the rhetoric of the far right. I think the biggest problem in terms of the European reception of refugees has been precisely that this has come on the back of a financial crisis that hit a lot of the countries that have to accept these refugees, such as Greece, Italy, Spain, and Southern and Eastern Europe the hardest. And those countries did not feel sufficient solidarity from Brussels and from the northern member states, the richer member states, to feel comfortable sort of that they would receive the support they felt they needed to accept these refugees and then pass them further on to Europe, where actually most of the refugees want to go, to Germany, to Scandinavia, to the UK, etc.
All right, Bernardo, I'll give you the final word then. Are you optimistic where you're sitting in Italy, or do you think that the far right will, in fact, gain?
Well, I mean, I think the current Italian government is rather split. There's a coalition of two different groups. One is a League party that is far right. The other is a movement that's really, a mix of different personalities and ideas. So I think the coalition will not last forever. It's probably that also this year the coalition will fall, and so I'm optimistic that something can change in the near future. And concerning the EU level, what my colleague just said is probably true, that some parties, also on the left, of the left-hand side, are just using the rhetoric of the far right to some extent. Yeah. But at the same time, let's keep in mind that the new parliament, the majority is not involved in the far right. That is a good news. It's a good news for the next 5 years, and that should be considered by the ruling parties. Thanks.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that as our final word, but of course we appreciate all of our guests for their time, their insight and analysis. I'm going to say thank you to Bernardo, Christian, and Peter, who were speaking to us in this segment about World Refugee Day. And of course, the context is important. That IDPs, in fact, internally displaced people, make up the vast majority of that 70.8 million figure that the UNHCR has released about those who have been displaced globally. But then, of course, it seems that we're talking less about IDPs, in fact, globally. than refugees or asylum seekers who are showing up in other countries, be it regional countries who, by the way, host the vast majority of global refugees, such as Lebanon and others, who are then causing and having their own issues because of pressures on infrastructure, than in fact those who are showing up in Europe or parts of the Western world, which are making the most noise, negative noise, one would add, about refugees and asylum seekers. Why is there this misplaced alarm on the part of much of the world about these people fleeing war and persecution? And why isn't there more help going towards countries like Lebanon and others who are hosting these vast numbers of refugees, even though their resources and their infrastructure simply is having a hard time accepting them or controlling or even giving them the proper resources to be able to be educated otherwise? These are all very important issues. And then, of course, the biggest issue, as always, in my mind, remains why isn't Europe and why isn't the international community, why isn't the UN doing more to resolve the political issues that create these refugees and asylum seekers or even IDPs to begin with? That remains something that remains largely ignored by the international community. I'll leave it there at that for this edition of Scope, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.